Do you like oysters? Raw, steamed, fried, deep fried? Mixed in batter or with eggs, they can also be used for fancy pancakes or omelets. Oysters are one of the most widely eaten seafoods around the world. But they get less attention in marine conservation or habitat protection than coral, even though oysters also face habitat loss in the oceans. Just like on our dinner plates, oysters make a nice side dish, but are rarely the main event. So today I want to shine the spotlight on the humble and happy oysters in this episode. This is Climate Watch. I'm Fei Fei. Welcome to another episode covering my trip to the city of Quanzhou in Fujian province, exploring how oysters can help us build a sustainable future. Oyster farming goes back at least 2,000 years. Greek philosophers, including Aristotle, wrote about harvest strategies for oysters in the Mediterranean. In China, people in Fujian and Guangdong started farming oysters as early as the Han Dynasty, some 1800 years ago. In Fujian, fishermen noticed oysters grow by attaching themselves to whatever surfaces they could find. Then they developed techniques like throwing stones into the water or planting bamboo poles in mud flats to cultivate oysters. 72-year-old Liu Dashan grew up in this environment. His village, Xiamen, literally meaning bridge south, is at the south end of the Luoyang Bridge, sitting at the estuary of the Quanzhou Bay.
Local villagers grow oysters with racks. They used whatever they had, bricks, stones, and the oysters would take hold and grow. But the racks had to stay upright and above the mud. If they sank and got buried, the oysters would die. So, day after day, people would head down to the shoreline, clearing away silt to keep their oysters alive.
Now, when the tide recedes, small oyster racks would emerge across the flats. Fishermen press 2 or 3 heavy stones into the mud, pitting them against each other in an upside-down V shape. They look like tiny camps from a distance. On the riverbanks, aunties shuck oysters and sell the meat in bowls. One told me that oysters are nearly a staple in their diet.
We eat oysters all the time, almost every day. Noodle soup, rice noodle soup, oyster omelets, even salty porridge with a few tossed in. However you cook them, they're tasty. But oyster omelets are the best.
On the streets of Quanzhou, vendors featuring oyster omelets are everywhere. Small oysters also appear in noodles or steamed rice in many restaurants. But oysters aren't just food. In the village of Xunpu, locals became famous for building houses with oyster shells. They stacked shells on the outer walls with mud, which suits the local humid climate and helped to withstand typhoons that slam the Fujian coast every summer and fall. Interestingly, these shells were not originally local. They came from Africa and Southeast Asia hundreds or even maybe 1,000 years ago. Larger than local species, historians believe they were used as ship ballast. The shells were discarded after voyages and later collected and repurposed by villagers into homes. This is just one example of how oysters have been woven into the lives of Quanzhou locals. But the most remarkable story is probably oysters' contribution to infrastructure. Back in the 1990s, Liu Dashan led a restoration project on the ancient Luoyang Bridge. At the base, they saw firsthand how oysters have been reinforcing the bridge for centuries.
The entire Luoyang Bridge was built without using cement. It is constructed entirely of stones. Once the stones set in water, oysters would cling to them. As the oysters grew, they spread into clusters, naturally binding the bridge's pieces together. And when there were larger gaps between the stones, the oysters would slowly fill them in, turning the whole structure into a stronger, more seamless whole.
The Luoyang Bridge is some 1,000 years old and is the earliest existing cross-sea girder bridge in China, also the first bridge to use biological methods with oysters acting as the living cement. Who came up with this idea to use oysters? The construction was documented on stone tablets on the bridge. The effort began in 1041 after many failed attempts to span the Luoyang River. Local history records the struggle.
Whenever wind and tide contend, no crossing may be made for days. Ships are lost, and the dead cannot be counted.
The background is, in the 11th century, Quanzhou was booming as a trade port, and the city needed a dependable way to connect its bustling streets with the bay. Here enters Cai Xiang, a seasoned official in his 40s, who decided it was time to build something bold, a stone bridge across the river. He had the political know-how to rally for money and manpower, but the scale was staggering. The project stretched 7 years and drained 14 million taels of silver. That is more than 1 billion yuan, or roughly $150 million in today's money. And the engineering was even tougher. The riverbed was soft and silty, hardly the ideal place to anchor stones. Cai Xiang's team came up with a solution. Lay down layers of stone to form a solid base, then raise more than 40 piers to hold the massive slabs, and then they would become the bridge floor. Li Guohong with the Chinese Society for the History of Overseas Trade and Transport explained to me in details.
First, they studied the tides, the force and direction of the water as it surged in, and the way it flowed back out again. With that knowledge, they shaped the bridge piers like the prow of a raft or bamboo boat. This is what we now call a raft foundation. By giving the piers this pointed, raft-like form, they were able to break up and deflect the force of the rushing water.
But challenges remained, even with a strong base.
With the constant pounding of tides, especially during spring tides or storms, water would crash against the bridge piers. Over the course of hundreds of years, day in and day out, some stones would inevitably become loose. So what could be done? Today, we might fill the gaps with cement. But cement didn't exist in ancient times.
This is where oysters came in.
In the end, the challenge was clear. How could they keep the bridge piers from being swept away by the rushing water? The answer wasn't dreamed up or calculated behind a desk. It was born after the wisdom of the people, shaped by their work and their lives along the river. Wild oysters grew in abundance around the Luoyang Bridge. They clung stubbornly to the stones because only with something solid to hold on to could they thrive. And oysters don't grow alone. They multiply quickly, clustering together in great masses. From the big clusters, smaller ones would sprout, layer upon layer, until, if left untouched, they rose like little mountains.
Li Guohong noted that the project's insight came from understanding local conditions: oysters, water, silt, and the weather. This is one of the earliest examples of what we now call nature-based solutions, or NBS. The United Nations highlights NBS as crucial for sustainable development. They can boost biodiversity, improve water quality, cut pollution, combat desertification, and restore degraded land and soils. They also have enormous potential in the fight against climate change. By 2050, alongside other decarbonization strategies, high-quality nature-based solutions would help the world reach net zero, mitigating up to 10 gigatons of CO2 annually, which is about 27% of the global emissions. So, what lessons can we take from the ingenious use of oysters for the Luoyang Bridge? I don't think it's about building another stone bridge, since today's materials and engineering can easily withstand saltwater erosion and tides. The question instead is how to draw inspiration from nature's designs. Some scholars have also looked to oysters. In Canada, scientists are studying what oysters use to attach to rocks, research that could one day lead to eco-friendly glues. In China, a team at Suzhou Institute of Nanotech and Nanobionics is exploring similar bioadhesives for medical use. And at Xiamen University, Professor Lizhe and his team are studying oyster shells more broadly.
We use oyster ash that's made by burning oyster shells and spread it over the soil. It's slightly alkaline because oyster shells are calcium carbonate. So when the soil is too acidic, it can get compacted and clump together. But with oyster shell powder, the soil becomes looser, more aerated. That means air can flow through it more easily. And not just air, water too. The moisture can move up and down through the soil much better.
The adaptation of oyster shell ash is already taking place in Quanzhou. In one of its counties called Hui'an, a pilot project started in 2018 has begun producing oyster shell ash on a larger scale. Today, local agriculture companies mix the ash into acidic farmland, where it helps neutralize the soil, enrich nutrients, and loosen its texture. The results are very encouraging. Yields of lettuce produced on this farmland have increased by about 20%. And the benefits go beyond harvests. Hui'an is now working with researchers from the Chinese Academy of Sciences who have been monitoring the fields. Their findings suggest the project could also cut carbon emissions, with the potential to reduce more than 5,600 tons of CO2 at this project. Jianyi is the director of the Academy's Urban Carbon Neutrality Research Center.
Part of this comes from the extra carbon stored in the soil as organic matter increases, and part comes from cutting back on fertilizers, which reduces nitrous oxide emissions. Based on our calculations, each acre of land saves roughly 3 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent.
At the end of last year, carbon credits from this project were traded through the Xiamen Carbon and Emission Rights Exchange, generating 100,000 yuan for 2 local companies. Scientists like Lizhe are also testing a module using oyster shells that can filter water. They put oyster shells in stream bags and toss them in natural water areas like rivers and the sea.
You pile up the oyster shells and put them in the water or along the shore. There's a lot of space in between, which can become a home for bacteria, small animals like little crabs. On top of that, biofilms can form on the surface of the shells, and these biofilms have the natural ability to break down pollutants.
Cai said this module, once proved effective, can provide a better and more eco-friendly alternative for sea walls. You see, from food to infrastructure, soil health, and water purification, oysters are quietly shaping a sustainable future. And that's why we're putting them in the spotlight today. If you liked today's episode and want to hear more, don't forget to follow Climate Watch on your favorite podcast platform. Leave us a quick review or share it with a friend. And if you have any suggestions for future episodes or stories you'd like to share, feel free to reach out to me at fei.fei@cgtn.com or find me on my Substack newsletter, Rivers and Mountains. Until next time.